Hello everyone and welcome to the last game we'll be showing from the FTX Crypto Cup round 6. It is a round before the final round, and the final round will be extremely action-packed as we will have a really incredible matchup. But before we get to that, we first have to check out what happened in the game between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja, and this is a game from the blitz section. So let me just fix that letter on the bird. Just give me a few seconds. There we go. All right, nicely done. I don't want to trick you guys. As you've seen, the match started by Magnus losing the first game of the Rapids. Then Magnus immediately bounced back. He won game 2. Then game 3 and game 4 of the Rapids ended in a draw. And this is now the blitz section. One of the blitz sections ended in a draw, and this one might not have. So let's dive straight into it. Magnus has the white pieces, and he opens with c4. Sorry about that. So c4, he goes for the English opening, same way as he did in game 2 of the Rapids, the one that he won. But in that game, Alireza countered it with knight to f6. Here he goes e5. We have g3 by Magnus, preparing to fianchetto his light square bishop. Knight to f6, we have bishop to g2 and bishop to c5. We have d3, and now Alireza castles. So a very open way of tackling the English. And as you can see, Magnus put his pawns on light squares. His light square bishop is on this diagonal, so you don't have to worry about developing it, and the dark square bishop free to roam in between the pawns on light squares. We have knight to f3, d6, and now knight to c3. And here there is a game from 2019 between Liem and Jordan van Foreest where a6 was played, but here we have c6 by Alireza, and it is now as of move 6 that we have a completely new game. So Magnus castles, and now comes pawn to a5. We have pawn to d4, sort of a delayed d4, as first Magnus played d3 and d4, and you might be expecting some further development of the pieces, but if you play something like bishop to g5, then Alireza immediately plays h6, and what is the bishop really doing there? Yeah, I mean, you don't really have a good square to go back to, you don't want to give it up for the knight, so that's why it makes sense to sort of waste the tempo on pawn to d4, e captures on d4, knight captures on d4, and now pawn to a4. Alireza says you will not be playing any b4 ideas anytime soon. Pawn to e3, and now pawn all the way to a3. And now, while Magnus could play b3, he decides that the queen to c2 is better. It's a developing move, and if pawn ever captures on b2, he will develop his bishop to this diagonal. So rook to e8 by Alireza, knight to b3, now attacking the bishop, and here a captures on b2. We have bishop captures. That's not a bishop captures, and here Alireza played a most peculiar move. He played bishop to e6. And Magnus is ready to capture on c5 and mess up Alireza's pawn structure. Now, bishop to a3 here prevents knight captures on c5, and also puts, this bishop on a nice a3 square, offering a trade of dark square bishop. So that's one way to do it. But after Alireza's bishop to e6, Magnus just captures on c5. So he destroys Alireza's pawn structure, decaptures on c5, and now knight back to e2, preparing knight to f4 to now put pressure on this light square bishop. So knight bd7, we have knight to f4, and now queen to e7. We have pawn to a4 by Magnus, trying to get pawn all the way to a5, then bishop comes to c3, and the pawn will be cemented here. Alireza plays rook to a6. He wants to go after the pawn before this happens, but Magnus says there's no way for you to stop this. Rook f to b1, we have rook e to a8, and now just bishop to c3. Magnus plays this even though the c4 pawn now seems vulnerable, but if you capture on c4, just bishop captures on f6, and that's it. The queen is attacked, the bishop is attacked. Alireza can just resign here. So after bishop to c3, rook 6 back to a7, and now pawn to a5. Now the pawn is nicely cemented here, so you don't have to worry about any b5 ideas from black. We have knight to e8, remaneuvering the knight now. Now the knight can come to c7, then maybe to a6 to b4. We have queen to d3, preparing to bring the rook over to the d file and put pressure on black's d file. Knight to d to f6, and now we have finally knight captures on e6. We have queen captures and the rook to d1. So the rook no longer needed on the b file, as Alireza put his rook here to defend the b7 pawn. But now, if Alireza plays a weird move, let's say moves the knight, then queen to d7 is definitely the way to go. So knight to c7 by Alireza, remaneuvering the knight over to b4 to put pressure on Magnus's queen. And now Magnus plays e4, all combined with the plan of bringing the queen to d7. He wants to play e5, kick away the knight, and then play queen to d7. We have knight to a6, pawn to e5, and now knight to e8, and now pawn to f4, cementing his pawn on e5, but also preparing pawn to f5. And here there's very little you can do about this. You could try the immediate g6, but Magnus's position is just a whole lot better. So here knight to b4 is what Alireza tries, attacks the queen, and now if Magnus moves the queen, then g6, and the position might be playable for black, even though it will be better for white. However, here Magnus goes for f5 right away, and you can't trade queens. If Alireza trades queens here, then your knight is hanging, f6 is hanging, this is game over. For example, knight b4 captures on f7, king captures, and now the rook infiltrates via the d7 square, and now the bishop pair will become unstoppable. For example, king here, now you can play bishop here, or you can push the pawn to e6, or open up an attack on the pawn right away, push e7, and maybe then bring the bishop here. So many options. So after this f5 move, we have queen to e7 by Alireza, and now just queen to d7. Magnus really playing this like a textbook game. Queen to g5, now trying to go for some queen to e3 check, maybe put pressure on the bishop, but Magnus says that is not happening. Pawn to e6, we have captures, and now just queen to e3 check, and king to h1. Magnus says you can never capture the bishop. If you do, queen f7, check, king h8, and this will be checkmate. So after king to h1, Alireza played b6. He attacked Magnus's queen on d7, but here Magnus just goes for the spectacular a captures on b6. He attacks the rook, and he offers a full queen here, but if Alireza accepts the queen, it is a forced winning sequence for Magnus, which is quite impressive, so I will show it. If rook captures on d7, then just e captures on d7. Now the knight is hanging, and also the rook is hanging. So how can you defend this? Let's say rook to d8, you are very happy to give up a knight. Now comes rook to e1, attacking the queen, and if of course the queen moves, then rook captures on e8, check, ends the game. So queen captures on e1, you will have to give back the queen. Rook captures, and it seems like you've sort of gotten back into the game after knight to d6, but here comes bishop captures, pawn captures, and c5. Now just removing the defender of the e8 square, and now you really don't have a good move. If the knight moves, just check wins the rook, and if of course you something rook captures on d7, then even bishop captures on c6, there's no move here. Rook to d8, c captures on d6, and still no moves. For example, rook captures b7. You can even give up the bishop for queening, and if rook to d8, just a very nice rook e8 check. You trade here, and then you promoted the pawn to a queen on the next move. So rook captures on d7 is impossible for Alireza. So a captures on b6 must have felt incredibly good when Magnus played it, and now Alireza plays knight to d3. It's such a tricky move. It's really maybe not the final resource, but he definitely gives Magnus an opportunity to blunder. For those of you who are maybe new to chess, maybe don't see immediately what he's going for, but if Magnus plays something like rook captures on a7, Alireza has a beautiful smothered mate here. Knight to f2 check, and now of course you all know what is happening. King g1 only move, knight to h3, a double check from the knight and the queen. Now if king here, this is checkmate. So king to h1, and now a wonderful queen sacrifice, queen g1 check, only move, rook captures on g1, and knight to f2, a beautiful smothered mate. So this is what Alireza tries with this tricky knight to d3 move, but of course Magnus instantly spots this as well, it's very rare that someone will overlook a smothered mate. So just queen captures on d3. Now he grabs more material, queen captures, and now it would be very silly to capture the queen. If you capture the queen, then Alireza easily wins. Rook captures, bishop captures, rook captures, and now you have to give up the bishop as well, as there's no way to get out of check. So bishop f1, rook captures, and now Alireza would simply be up a full piece and completely winning. If rook here, king here, rook to b1 stops the passed pawn, that's all there is to it. So after this, queen captures on d3, b captures on a7, Magnus grabs the a7 rook, queen captures on c3, Alireza grabs the bishop, and now bishop captures on c6, attacks the knight and the rook. So you have to move the rook, but there's really not a good square because then a8 comes. So here just rook captures on a7, rook captures, and now queen captures on c4. So Alireza has a queen and the knight against the Magnus's two rooks and the bishop, but also there is the problem of the passed pawn on e6, and Magnus just plays rook to a8. Point being that now if queen captures, then Magnus just picks up the queen, rook captures on e8 check, and Alireza has to part with the queen. So here g6, creating some breathing room for his king. Now rook captures on e8 with check, king g7, and now pawn to e7. So as you can see, with the light square bishop controlling this diagonal and with the rook controlling the back rank, there is no actual way of the queen ever delivering check to the white king. So the only way is to deliver it through the back rank or through this diagonal. As Magnus controls this, the queen is helpless against the white king. So queen to e2, Alireza goes after the rook. Now comes rook to g8 check. Magnus just goes for the easiest way to win this. He gives up the rook, and then if king captures, pawn to e8, queen will force the trade here. We can even show it. Queen here or rook doesn't really matter. Captures, and Magnus is up too much material. So after this check, Alireza plays king to h6, still hoping to grab the rook here, but Magnus even allows it. Just e8 queen, he gives up the rook on d1, queen captures, king to g2, and now queen to c2 with check. Now it is all over, of course, but Alireza will try to force some sort of a perpetual. King to f3, now queen to f5 with check, and king to e3. Magnus has to bring the king to an open board to stop the check at some point using the bishop or the queen. So queen g5 check, king to e2, now comes queen to g4 check, and bishop to f3. Queen to c4 check, we have king to f2, and now queen to a2 check. The last trick Alireza has up his sleeve, if queen to e2, then he can pick up the rook on g8, and it would still be winning for Magnus, but it would be annoying. So Magnus just played bishop to e2, and he was in this position on move 48 that Alireza Firouzja resigned the game, and Magnus wins the match in the blitz section. So he didn't win it in rapid, he didn't grab the full points, but he still won it in the blitz section. So here you resign because, let's say you play something c4, you want to push your passed pawn. It's a very simple checkmate. Let's say queen e3 check, the king can't go back, you have to go, you can't even go anywhere, you have to play g5, and then just queen captures will be checkmate. So that's all there is to it. So after bishop to e2, of course, Alireza resigned. And what does this mean for the final round? Who can win the event? Well, these are the standings after the penultimate round. Magnus is leading with 15 points, followed by Praggnanandhaa with 13 points. Praggnanandhaa had a brutal game match against Jan-Krzysztof Duda, where he lost, but he was on his way to bounce back in the blitz section, and then Pragg just overlooked him 8-1. It was brutal. It was, I mean, I've seen a video when Pragg did it. You know, his headphones just flew all the way back. His chair flew all the way back. He couldn't believe what he had done. But still, as he made it past the rapids, he went into the blitz tiebreaks. He got 1 point. So he is on 13 points. And in the final round, we have the clash between Praggnanandhaa and Magnus Carlsen, which means only the two of them can win the FTX Crypto Cup. Alireza is on 12 points, but there's no actual way for him to win. Even if he wins, and he's playing against Levon Aronian, even if he beats Levon, and if he beats him in the rapids, he will get the full 3 points. He will have 15, exactly as Magnus. But if Magnus remains on 15, that will mean that he lost to Alireza in the rapid section, which means, to Praggnanandhaa in the rapid section, which means that Pragg will be on 16 points, as he will be awarded 3 points. So even if Alireza wins and Magnus loses in the rapids, we will have Praggnanandhaa on 16, and Magnus and Alireza will be sharing second place with 15 points. So basically, only Magnus and Pragg can win this, and they face each other in the final round. That's incredible. It is absolutely, I mean, wild. It is more than we could have asked for, and it will be a great day for chess. That's the game and a little bit of info about the standings. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I would like to thank Attila Kalsha, Brian Enriquez, Dirai Krishna Kumar, Lucian Grozov, and Akshay Pandit for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the FTX Crypto Cup until it finishes, and then we are showing the game between Stockfish and Chess Master Grandmaster Edition. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.